thank you, Ken. I appreciate the introduction and appreciate the invitation to my first visit to Florida, not to mention Pensacola itself. Yeah. And coming from Santa Fe, New Mexico, it's pretty flat and green here. What I'd like to do for you tonight is to try to give you a little introduction to the U.S. National Laboratory structure, in particular the National Security Laboratories, and I'll say a little more about that. And these are labs that were founded as an outcome of mostly World War II, government investment in big science in World War II. A couple of prominent examples of things that came out of that, of course, was the atomic bomb at Los Alamos. Another one is radar that came out of MIT and what is now Lincoln Lab up in Massachusetts. And many other kinds of technologies were done. And the governments continued to invest in science and technology through many vehicles, one of which is the Department of Energy. Department of Energy is a follow-on to what used to be the Atomic Energy Commission, the old AEC, that went through several changes and ended up being the Department of Energy. Interesting place, and of course the role of the laboratories is to advance science, as well as, of course, to help enable and execute the missions of that department. And they're pretty diverse. One government official once told me Department of Energy does everything from weather stripping to nuclear weapons. And that's about right. And so just to give you a sense of that, here's a map, and there are 17. I'm not going to talk about, Lincoln Lab is a Department of Defense lab, and there's a series of those. I will not talk about them tonight. But there are 17 Department of Energy labs that are shown on the map here. None of them are in Florida, though. I don't know what that means, but and they're each focused on some element of the Department of Energy's mission. And of the 17, about 10 of them are really focused around fundamental science. 3 of them that I'm going to spend most of this evening talking about are around national security. That is Lawrence Livermore up in California in the Bay Area, Los Alamos, and Sandia in New Mexico. And there's also one about the renewable energy, one about nuclear energy, one about environmental development or environmental remediation, and so forth. Many of the labs are single purpose, especially the science labs, like the Fermi Lab or SLAC over in the BayArea. They generally have a big accelerator, a big machine that they use to do some very special kinds of science. You may see a lot in the news about the machine off in Switzerland, CERN, looking for the Higgs boson. Of course, a lot of these labs participate in the teams that are off doing that work. And the U.S. has similar kinds of facilities to look at different aspects of the fundamental processes of the nature. But some of the labs are also multi-program labs, where they have a primary focus, but they do work for lots of different missions. And in fact, the 3 national security labs are all multi-purpose labs like that. I want to spend, let me say a couple words about myself, just to add to Ken's introduction. I really had a remarkable career that I wonder how I ever deserved. Very privileged to have done things that I've done, starting with being a theoretical physicist working in the US and in Europe, then starting doing applied research, doing nuclear weapons design work, and then ultimately becoming leader of these 2 remarkable institutions. At the same time, my career in the laboratory spanned the Cold War, when we were hot in the build-up from Reagan and Carter, to the end of nuclear testing, the end of weapon development, the period of, oh God, what are we going to do now? And President Clinton signing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. A few years later, Congress failing to ratify it, and then being in today's world where we're focused on carrying out the government's policies about nuclear weapons. So I've seen all that. So that's an interesting perspective. And just a few words about what is one of these laboratories like. I'm now going to focus on the three national security labs, Los Alamos, Sandia, and Lawrence Livermore. And let me speak about Los Alamos because that's the thing I remember the most recently, and as you get older, you forget things. And also, I live close by, so I can get, they still talk to me and give me information. So Los Alamos right now is about $2.1 billion per year institution with about 10,000 employees. So pretty big place to manage and to lead. Of the 10,000 employees, about 2,000 or more than 2,000 have PhDs in some areas of science. I believe, although I haven't really done a formal search, I think that's the highest concentration of PhD scientists anywhere in the country, maybe anywhere in the world. And not only PhDs, but there's another 1,400 or so people with master's degrees. So it's a pretty high-tech place. It's about 40 square miles spread all over the place. And it's very multidisciplinary. Many different kinds of science go on there, and I'll give you a little flavor of that as we go. Let me move on. So what are the missions of these laboratories? Well, at the three national security laboratories, the core, the essential mission that's persisted for basically 70 years is around nuclear weapons. Now, what that means has changed many times over the years. As I just gave you an example in my career, we went from a very active Cold War stance to today, where the policy of the government is pretty clear that nuclear deterrent is still a significant part of the country's security posture, while at the same time we have aspirations as a country for a world without nuclear weapons. So you're trying to balance those two aspects of policy. And in particular, what the labs are really focused on now, since we're not building new weapons and we're not doing nuclear testing, it's really about how can we provide the confidence to the government, particularly the president, and the commander at Strategic Command in the military, that these weapons, the deterrent is safe, it's secure, and it's effective. If the president, heaven help us ever, is in a position where he has to make a decision to use something. And so that's a pretty interesting job. And of course, the job is made more complicated, at least in the mind of a scientist, because you can't test it. We don't have nuclear testing, so you have to be confident and sure, but you can't actually do the final integrated test to demonstrate that. And well, is that a problem? We built them, they're fine, we tested them. What could be the problem? And of course, the problem is it's a problem of chemistry. You have a nuclear weapon, which is just a collection of plastics and metals and radioactive material sitting in a test tube for decades. And of course, they're chemically incompatible. And so over time, chemistry happens and changes start to happen. And it's kind of like a car. You buy a new car and you sit in it and it smells like a new car, right? And why does it smell like a new car? Well, all the plastics are outgassing. They release gases that have an odor that you smell. Well, the plastics in a nuclear weapon outgas too. And the stuff that comes off, what does it do? How does it chemically react with other things? And the answer is it does. Just like your car, you know, if you leave it out in the sun too long, especially in a place like New Mexico at 7,000 feet, you start cracking the dashboard and things like that, because the sun just sits there and bakes that plastic, and it starts to change the plastic. Well, the equivalent of that in a nuclear weapon is the nuclear material, the radiation, and it sits there and radiates on all these materials at the same time. So similar kinds of problems. So what do we do about that? Oh, and one other problem is, of course, some of these weapons were developed and deployed back in the 70s. So they're pretty old. And I don't know if you remember what electronic technology was back in the 70s. How many remember changing vacuum tubes in their television? Yeah. Well, some of these weapons have vacuum tubes in them, right? And so, well, if it starts to get old and you put the tester on it and it kind of gives in the red area, right? So where do you go buy another vacuum tube? So lots of different kind of challenges. So actually, it's quite a daunting scientific challenge that the laboratories face. And the approach, and Ken alluded to that in the introduction, the approach that we've taken, the country's taking, is to develop a more fundamental science and engineering-based understanding of how one of these things work. And you use that with all the history of nuclear testing that you have, and use that as a basis for judgments. And that's pretty challenging because it's a complicated object, the nuclear weapon. It operates at many scales, at the subatomic scale when you think about the nuclear aspects, all the way up to the macroscopic scale. Time scales from billionths of a second to minutes. And you have temperatures and pressures that could be very cold if you're sitting out on the wing of the B-52 up at 40 or so thousand feet. It gets pretty cold. Or when it actually functions, you have temperatures and pressures like at the center of the sun. And so you have to be able to represent all of those different scales and conditions to understand what one of the things might do. And so the labs had to invest in a lot of computational simulation capability and a lot of experimental capability to help get at the bottom of these issues, and to have a surveillance program, a program where every year you take apart a few of these and look in the side and see what's it look like. And if something turned to green cheese, is that good? Is that bad? Is it a one-off, or is it endemic of all of them? Do you need to fix it? If you fix it, you have to rebuild it, and you can't test it if you rebuild it. So what's the right thing to do? And by the way, some of the technology that we've had to develop is pretty amazing. We all turned off our cell phones. When I was doing nuclear design in the in the 80s, we used the very best supercomputers that were available anywhere in the world. And those computers had less computing power than your iPhone. You think about that. And now we have computers that are 10 billion times faster than the ones I used back in the 80s, 10 billion times faster. And they can perform tens of petaflops. I had to explain to a congressman what a petaflop was. And I said it was 1,000 trillion operations per second. And he was really bothered by that. And I said, well, how about 1,000,000 billion? He said, oh, he liked that much better. So 1,000,000 billion operations per second, and we're a factor of 10 beyond that now. So with that, this kind of fundamental approach, we've actually confronted quite a number of problems that have come up and dealt with them successfully over the last 20 plus years. So that's a great success. But as time goes on, they keep getting older, and the country's made a decision over the next few decades, we're going to, you always debate about words. I think the current word is modernize the stockpile, and so the ones that are going to endure, that stay in the stockpile as part of the deterrent as the numbers continue to come down, we're going to go renew them. And you can't use the word new. That's verboten. So we're going to not rebuild them the same as they were, because you can't rebuild them the same as they were. because some of the materials are not available, like vacuum tubes. Some of them are environmentally hazardous and are outlawed. You can't use the stuff anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of challenges. But they were embarked off on that. And the goal, of course, is to as you renew the deterrent, to make sure it's safe, secure, and effective for the next, for another 30 years, and do it without being able to test it. So that's the first piece. And the most interesting thing about the laboratory is the really challenging or state-of-the-art science, technology, capabilities, and people and machines and so on that it takes to do that is pretty impressive. And it turns out you can do a lot of other things with that capability too. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time not talking about nuclear weapons, but talking about some of the other things we do with that same capability. And so, one is about nuclear proliferation, and that gets in the news a lot, at least the news I read. I don't know about you guys. I'm kind of weird though. So, and the labs are very involved in counter-proliferation and in counter-terrorism, especially around nuclear things, and that's a natural because we know a lot about nuclear things. And generally the kind of work we do is supporting government agencies, the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State. We give them a lot of technical support that's either hardware, we build widgets that they go use, or it's analysis. And just to give you some examples, in the upper left and lower left, you see two satellites. One is the Vela satellite that in 1963 was put up in space, built by Los Alamos and Sandia to monitor the Earth for nuclear explosions. And this was done, I think they went up a few weeks after the US and the Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And this was a part of the verification process the US put in place to assure that although they signed the treaty, are they really abiding by it? And those satellites were up there for a couple decades and variations of them as time goes on. And there's no longer Vela satellites, but there are other things that are flying to continue to monitor for those kinds of things. So that's an example of sensors in space looking for the certain signature that would tell you there was a particular kind of explosion happening somewhere on the Earth. That's a pretty challenging task, by the way. And the Institute, Ken was telling about a lot of the work that's done here and work with NASA and so forth. So maybe not so unfamiliar, but having an instrument in space that's in a vacuum, that's generally cold unless it's on the side that sees the sun, and then it's pretty hot, and it has to be really high reliability because you can't get up there and fix it if it goes bad. At least back in the 60s, you surely couldn't. And it's autonomous, and it has to be extremely high reliability because you're counting on it. Turns out a lot of those are the same skills it takes to put in a nuclear weapon. So that's interesting. What else do we do? And I'm going to go through a lot of this quickly. Oh, and by the way, let me go through this quickly. Another one, they colored kind of a sphere with the cutout you see in the middle. That is the latest computer simulation of the Earth in a simulation tool that can look at the results of a seismograph to see some kind of event on the Earth's surface somewhere and decide whether it was an explosion or a natural event like an earthquake, distinguish that, and not only be able to tell you it was an explosion, but be able to tell you exactly where it happened. So when something happens in North Korea, which it has, where exactly did it happen? It's very difficult to tell it was a nuclear test through this. It was a nuclear explosion. It could have been a chemical explosion. But where did it happen? Did it happen where the intelligence community sees all their activity around getting ready for what looks like a nuclear test? In which case that gives you some hints. So can you pinpoint, is it someplace you're not looking? What's going on out there in the world? And of course you have to know the detailed geology of the Earth to know how the seismic wave propagates through the Earth to where you have your seismometer to go measure that. So it's building more and more sophistication in your analysis tool to get at what might be going on. In the lower right, you see the former president of Iran walking through his collection of centrifuges at one of their facilities. That's a public picture, public available picture, so I can show you that to you. And another thing the lab does is it does a lot of analysis as the intelligence community picks up snippets of information. What could be going on? And you never get a complete picture, you just get little factoids that might or might not be true with some level of confidence, and you have to piece that together and try to understand, well, what might be going on there, what might they be doing with that, and in the case of Iran, are they developing a nuclear weapon? If so, when might they have it? And that's a real high visibility question that the country struggles with, and I can tell you, the labs have been in there with the head of the CIA and other senior government officials having that conversation with them. Here's what we think we know. Here's what we've seen. Here's what we can conclude from that. Here's our confidence in that, including when do we think they might be able to do that. So the labs play a big role in that because some would say if you're looking for a nuclear weapons program, the best person to look for it is a nuclear weapons program. And so that's a lot of what we do. We do that in places like Iran and North Korea, but we also do it in other places where less obvious things are going on, and you wonder, what is happening there and what might that lead to sometime in the future. So there's lots of other stuff that goes on. As I say, these foreign assessments, what's going on in Russia? Are they thinking about nuclear weapons the same way we do, and this, our government, or they have a different attitude? Are they building up? Are they building new capabilities that might be a threat? What does it all look like? How do you assess that? And there's a lot of that work done in very detail, and some of it's been going on for decades. And as I say, you may remember, well, let's see, I would say maybe 10-ish years ago, there was a big deal in Libya where it turns out Libya was trying to develop a nuclear weapons program, and the US government and others convinced Gaddafi that he should give it up. And there were people that went in to help assess where they were and to take apart their program. Los Alamos, the international agency that goes out and does inspections in countries around the world to see are they following their treaty obligations. Those inspectors are trained at Los Alamos National Laboratory. We bring them in there and show them real nuclear material, and of course in an appropriate, safe place, and give them the tools that they're going to use and show, well, if you find it, this is what your sensor is going to do, and give you some experience in doing it in ways that somebody might be trying to hide it or something, and so you give them experience of what it's really like, so when they're out there, they are better able to make good judgments. And of course, we do a lot of emergency response work. Some of it related to nuclear stuff. The Department of Homeland Security may, one of their border sensors or something might go off, and what's going on? And so the labs are there 24/7, on call, to provide technical support for things like that. So that's interesting. And any of these subjects I can go on and on, but I'm supposed to watch the clock. We only have so much time. As I said, with the satellites, we've been in space, and we've been doing that for over 50 years. And it turns out, in Los Alamos as an example, they've put more than 1,400 sensors on more than 400 instruments on more than 60 satellites over the years in space. And some of it's for national security purposes with the intelligence community, and some of it's for science and particular support of NASA. And so we've done a lot of work with that. And so my next example, and this is one that's currently going on, is the Curiosity mission to Mars, NASA mission. And the rover that's there, you may have remembered, I think it was last year, all the concern about this rover that was going to land on Mars, and it was encompassed in this big balloon and was going to bounce, and will everything break or survive? And well, that's this thing. That was in there, and it did survive. And you may have heard just a couple months ago an announcement that NASA has concluded there is water on Mars. And one of the reasons is through this. And Los Alamos has two of the sensors on that rover were developed at Los Alamos for NASA, as well as the power supply to supply power and heat. And the little red thing on the right is the heat source, power source. It turns out it's a radioisotope of plutonium, and if it's an even number, 238, that means it's not very fissionable, but it does decay and it does radiate, so you can harvest that to make energy. And basically all the NASA missions, especially deep space missions, have one of these power sources on it because it's very small and lightweight, and it can last for decades. So that's very neat, and Los Alamos is the unique place in the country where those things are made. So that's there, and the even more interesting thing are the two sensors that are kind of called out there on the chart. One is called ChemCam and one's called ChemMin. ChemCam is it's kind of simple. It's a laser that sits on the end of that beam there, and you can point it at a rock and shoot the laser, and it vaporizes the rock. And it actually vaporizes not just the surface, but into the rock some depth. And it creates this plasma, and from a standoff distance, this plasma is just sitting there in front of the rock, that the instrument is a spectrometer, and what it does is it looks at that plasma that comes off the rock, it vaporizes the rock, and from the colors and the intensity of the different colors it sees in that vapor, it can identify the atomic species of the material that it vaporized. And that's a standard technique. By the way, that's how we learn a lot about the universe. You look at these spectral lines to see what kind of materials make up stars and all the things that are out there. And interesting enough, just like when a train goes by and you hear the Doppler effect, the train goes by and the whistle changes pitch as it moves past you, light does the same thing. And if you look at where these particular color lines are, and as they shift, you can tell how fast the galaxy is moving away from you. It's called the redshift, and then you can use that to decide how old the universe is. So same kind of thing, only this is a little different. You're doing this in a standoff way, so that's pretty tricky, but we're able to do that. And then the second one is the ChemMin, which is a soil analyzer. There's a scoop on an arm there, and it picks up stuff and dumps it in a little thing that goes into an instrument that's actually on the rover. And there they do X-ray diffraction. What that is you take, if you imagine the crystal structure of a metal, if you look at the little atoms are all in a nice regular structure, that's what makes it a metal. And if you look at that shape, or any kind of, it's not a liquid, it's a gas, it's a solid, and the structure of the solid, when you shine the X-rays on it, the pattern of reflections you see depend on exactly what that structure looks like. And by unfolding that, you can figure out what kind of material it was. That's, by the way, how they discovered the structure of DNA in people, the Watson-Crick, the double helix. They discovered that by doing X-ray diffraction. So same thing here, only it's in a little different circumstances. And together with that and some of the other instruments, they were able to conclude there's water on Mars. And of course, the rover's still up there as we speak, moving around and collecting data, and there will be more discoveries that come out as we understand the origin of the planets in our solar system and the world, and that will be fascinating. So let me move on to another example. With a little bit of time I have. There's other things that have come out of the technology at the labs that are a byproduct of our national security mission, and one of them is biology. And of course, I would always pause and say, biology? What's that got to do? Well, it turns out, interesting, back in the very early days, people didn't understand the effects that radiation has on living things. So how harmful can radiation be? What kind of radiation is the most harmful? At what doses? Does it matter if it's a pulse or just a steady over a period? All of these questions that you have. Well, the labs had the skills to go look at that and started getting involved in that and have been doing that for decades. But to do it, what they did is they started looking at cells and how cells behave with radiation, and they have to understand a cell and how it works, and DNA was discovered, and so they have to understand DNA and how that works. So that's interesting. But, unlike typical biologists in the university at the time, the lab also has a lot of computing and a lot of engineering. And so one day in the 80s, scientists came to the director of Los Alamos at the time, Sig Hecker, and said, the biologists say you could sequence the human genome, but it's foolish to try because it'll take forever. And these guys came in and said, we know how we could do it quickly, or relatively quickly. And that was the start of the Human Genome Project at Los Alamos. And Los Alamos and Livermore were part of a consortium that went and did that, and several of the genes in the human genome were identified by Livermore and Los Alamos. And of course, as they showed how to do it, then the Craig Ventners and others in the world took over that and went and finished the job. So that's interesting. So here we have a national security application. The knowledge from that spins off into a civilian application, which is understanding human genome. Well, if you can sequence the human genome, people started asking us, well, what about some pathogens? We're really worried about anthrax and things like that. Can you help us understand that? So then we went off and figured out how to sequence those things. And then we discovered that those sequences, that you don't have to sequence the whole DNA, that like a fingerprint, if you look at just in certain places in the genome, in that sequence, there are some unique identifiers of things like anthrax. And actually you can look and identify specific strains and differentiate those. Well, now that's interesting. So here we are spinning back into national security. And of course the question then is, can you develop a sensor to tell us whether any of that stuff's around? And now that you have this unique fingerprint and the engineering, the computation, and the biology, the answer is yes. And in fact, at the Salt Lake Winter Olympics was the first time we deployed some sensors like that. And they are now deployed around the country. There's no sign on it that says that's what it is, but they're out there and they're watching for this. They're looking for aerosolized, something that's in the air. And so they suck air in and do analysis and so forth. And it looks like a EPA air monitor kind of thing. So that's interesting. Well, now if you can do that for Anthrax. What about a naturally occurring pathogen, like SARS or something else that we all worry about, avian flu? Well, it turns out when I was at Livermore, the state got a hold of a lab in the state of California and was very worried because down in Southern California, there was a big infectious disease attack called exotic Newcastle disease. And it was killing off flocks of chickens. And all the people, the farmers who raised the chickens and for various things, were in deep trouble and having to kill, just like the mad cow disease in England, they were having to kill off all their flocks because they couldn't tell whether the chickens were infected or not. And they couldn't afford to let that happen. Because at the time, if you did an assay of a chicken to decide if it's infected, it took 6 to 12 days to get an answer. Well, that's just way too long. And so the laboratory was able to give back to the state in a few weeks an assay that took 4 hours. And that meant that the farmer now could go test the chickens and isolate the ones that were infected and kill those off and save most of their flock. Fascinating. And today, Los Alamos is working on a vaccine for HIV. And that's the latest manifestation of this. And it's fascinating, and I'll give the short version of it. The challenge, there are vaccines for lots of things, and I just had my flu shot. It turns out HIV is a very onerous or ornery virus, because actually it's a pretty lousy virus, because when it reproduces itself, it's not very good. In fact, up to 35%, the offspring in a reproduction, up to 35% is wrong. Is different from the original. And so it mutates, and it mutates very quickly. And so a vaccine goes in and builds up antibodies against the virus that's there. And it stimulates the body to build the immune system to go respond. But the HIV virus changes faster than the body can develop new, the immune system can respond to the change. And so that's how the infection can spread very well and been unsuccessful. And so the lab, one of the researchers at the lab have come up with a process, something called a mosaic vaccine, a mosaic approach, which is, can we build a protein as part of a vaccine to inject into the human that has the features of many different strains of HIV. And so when we stimulate the body, it's generating many different kinds of these proteins that will develop the antibodies to fight the virus. And that way you cover the landscape of where it might mutate to. And because the lab has the world database on over 2,000 strains of HIV, and it keeps that for world consumption, it's a service the lab does, they're able to analyze all that, understand the genetics, how it mutates, where it goes, where's the, and be able to pick out places in that whole spectrum to say these are the things we want to capture and use that to develop the vaccine. And I'm told that I think about right now is when they're starting the first human trials. And again, this is work the lab's doing to support Duke University, that is the leader in this consortium that's building. The lab's not off doing human testing, is my point. Let's see, how much time do I have? Well, let me do quickly one last thing, and that's climate. As you've heard, a theme through all the things I've said is computation and simulation. And just like a nuclear weapon is a multi-scale, from the subatomic to the macroscopic, billionths of a second to minutes and hours, the Earth's climate system is also interesting. And it's a very coupled system of the atmosphere, the land, the ocean, and all the elements of that. And they all interact and feed off each other in ways that are very complicated. And it's multiple kinds of science that are all interacting. The labs got involved with climate back in the 80s. Some of you may remember there was a big concern if there was a nuclear war, a big exchange of nuclear weapons, we'd have nuclear winter. And Carl Sagan was somebody that talked a lot about that. And so the lab started working to look at the validity of those thoughts. And that's all morphed into today's version, which is not worried about that, but we are worried about what is humankind doing to affect the climate and what might that mean. So it's a big computational simulation job of much of the same kind of science that goes into nuclear weapons. So the science has got a lot of similarities and a method to attack it through simulation, because again, you can't do a test. Right, just like the nuclear weapon, you can't go do a test of the climate to see, well, is my theory right? That if you do this, then that's what's going to happen? Well, I don't know. Let's wait, 50 years and see. And so how do you have confidence? And again, some of the same kinds of challenges that we've had. And without going into too much detail, as an example, Los Alamos, there's the model for the atmosphere, for the land, for the ocean, and for the sea ice. And two of those four models, the ocean and the sea ice are developed at Los Alamos. At Livermore, they do the intercomparison. All the people around the world that have climate models that make predictions, they all send into Livermore, and Livermore, it's kind of like the good housekeeping seal. They go and look at them, and they actually do a calculation with each of them where they do it all on the same basis, because sometimes they make different assumptions or have different input data. So they figure all that out and make sure they run the same calculation on all of them, and then they're able to compare. And here's an example, and I had a movie, but I think this is good enough. This is the ocean circulation, and the colors, the red of the color, the higher the temperature, the bluer the color, the lower the temperature. This is a three-dimensional model. That is to say, it has the floor of the ocean modeled in it, all the detailed structure of the floor of the ocean, and of course all the land masses. And in it actually you can see the seasons. This happens to be winter in the northern hemisphere, as you can imagine, and you can watch how. And it's interesting because it's warm in that band, right? And it looks in the summer in the north, it looks similar. And you can see the Gulf Stream as water dumps into the Gulf here, and watch it circulate and go out and head up the northeast coast and off to Europe and off to England. Fascinating watching all that, and that's really cool. And it has enough resolution, as you can see, the little swirls, like the swirl going down a drain, it's called, and vorticity. And you have to have really high resolution in your simulation to be able to see those things develop. That's interesting. In the last couple years, labs put chemistry in too. So it's not just the ocean and temperature and so forth, but it actually has the chemistry of what goes on. If you all remember, some of you probably remember biology, that a plant takes sunlight and chlorophyll and turns CO2 into oxygen, carbon dioxide into oxygen. Well, what are we worried about in the climate? One of the things that the big worries is carbon dioxide. Well, plants, change carbon dioxide into, plants are good for that. And where do you think most of the plants are in the world? Well, they're not on land, they're in the ocean. It's algae and all that kind of stuff. And phytoplankton. That's a new word I learned when I first got into this. And so they put the chemistry in, so you can actually see the chemical processes as the algae grows and wanes, as the temperature changes, and of course it's three-dimensional, so as the temperature columns and what's really fascinating, maybe I'll walk over and point, and then I'll stop here, in the southeast part of Africa, when you run this chemistry model with the circulation model, you see this bloom of algae. There's a period of time during the year where all of a sudden all this algae growth and all this chlorophyll is formed, and it generates all kinds of oxygen. And that's interesting because it turns out if you look at marine life, at that period of the year, that's one of the most active areas in the ocean for marine life, because that's where all the algae is. And so the little things are there eating, and then the bigger things eat the little things, and so there's all kinds of great. The other thing is, I can't reach it, but up in the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia, it turns out that there's another big bloom of algae that happens there. As the sea ice from the Arctic, it retreats in the summer, then the sun, hits the ocean, and thermal stuff happens, and it brings up nutrients from the bottom of the ocean, and in the warm ocean, there's this big bloom of algae that grows there. And the estimates are that of all the oxygen generated on Earth, about 20% of it comes from right there. And that's interesting. Something I didn't know. So fascinating. And so what's it all mean? Well, maybe I'll just stop here and well, I'll tell you what I think. What I think, this is now a personal opinion, what I think is I do think that humankind has an impact on the Earth system, on the climate, as well as many other things, because, yeah, and that I would be very wary of anybody's prediction of anything. They may be right and they may not be right, and it's really hard to know what that is.